It is October 28th, 1776. George Washington has been retreating from New York City, and in pursuit is General Howe of the British Army. And he now has the help of Hessians who came over from Hesse Castle and other parts and sects of Germany. Washington has been defeated at the Battle of Brooklyn, and he made a miraculous victory of a sense in upcoming weeks prior, or in the weeks prior. But he needs to protect his stockpile, pretty much, in Fishkill. So he comes to the conclusion of White Plains, where there are multiple hills that overlook the area and can be controlled with the high ground. So he sets up multiple defenses on these hills, and they dig in. And in a sense, it kind of reminds Howe of Bunker Hill. Howe has learned his lesson, and from his mistakes at Bunker Hill, he's learned that the American Army, or the Continental Army, is a foe to actually not underestimate. So he sets up the stage to attack the very hill that I'm standing on. And to call it a hill is quite an understatement. Where we are at sits hundreds of feet above elevation. And that's where we're at today, at Chatterton Hill, where sadly not much of it remains. But it's here at this spot where the Battle of White Plains begins. Now, this is my view of Chatterton Hill. It's been turned into a park, sadly, where you can barely see in the undergrowth here, but it is steep. There's tops of houses through those trees. And if I come around and walk it, I got probably some rocks or stuff that were here during the battle. But this entire spot here was where the Continentals held their ground. Now, if I come to the street, you'll be able to see, here's a park. There's more towards the other way, but family's over there. But this is a broad view of the park. If I swing around this way, about how high this hill is, where that car just went, crested down the hill, you'll see, and I can cross over here, the hill still is rising, but we're at the peak, more or less. But if I come over here, you see these buildings. And you could tell just how high up we are. Especially if I zoom in on maybe that building right there. We're higher than that building. from this elevation. So let's zoom all the way back out. And then we can look at the park. Now, this is what happens when you don't save national parks. I don't want to say that at first. This is what happens when you don't preserve battlefields. You have all this buildings. You have all this construction that happens, and you lose it. And then this park here, sadly, is what happens when it's a last moment thing. That didn't necessarily happen for the Battle of White Plains. It's a tragedy in and of itself for how the people wanted to memorialize this battle that's forgotten. And sadly, it's forgotten not mainly because it's not preserved, but it's also forgotten because it's brushed over. Because in the coming weeks and months, we see the Battle of Trenton, we see the Battle of Princeton, Trenton 2, we see Brandywine, we see countless other battles that have been given a larger scope, and the White Plains is just brushed over. This is part of Washington's retreat from New York and back down into the campaigns of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and that's where we see it. So that's why White Plains usually gets brushed over. But that's why I'm here, and I want to tell you what took place. So let's get to it. So one of the books I have with me here is Battle Maps of the American Revolution by the American Battlefield Trust. Other than Stony Point that didn't make it into this map list, White Plains did. So I'm going to get into the American Battlefield Trust's overview of this battle on page 34. October 28th, 1776, Battle of White Plains. The battles around New York City were a disastrous chapter in the career of George Washington. The commander-in-chief fielded the largest number of soldiers, roughly 23,000, that he commanded at any one battle of campaign. But taking on the combined might of the Royal Navy and British Army meant taking on 130 ships and some 32,000 of the King's soldiers and Hessian auxiliaries. Washington's forces were saved by the inaction of William Howe at Brooklyn Heights when he failed to land the killing blow on roughly 9,500 Continental soldiers cornered on Long Island. Colonel John Glover and his Marbleheaders ferried the Continentals to safety. On September 11, 1776, the failed Staten Island Peace Conference ushered in fighting at Kip's Bay, where the British forced a landing on Manhattan Island. Washington's men made a stand at Harlem Heights, earning a small victory. That's the one I was talking about. But William Howe, utilizing the Royal Navy and his tactical sense for maneuver, forced Washington to abandon the island and retreat north. A slow British pursuit allowed the Continental Army to take up a position at White Plains, New York, along the banks of the Bronx River. The Americans fortified their southward-facing position with the left resting on Hatfield Hill and Horton's Mill Pond, and their center resting on Purdy Hill, and across the 14-foot wide Bronx River sat Washington's right atop Chatterton Hill. That's where we stand right now. The initial defense of the hill fell to militiamen, who did a poor job of fortifying the wooded ridgeline. Rather, they utilized the stone walls of the local farms for their defensive works. I also read that they used corn stalks as well to make it look like breastworks as well. The British Army approached the town and pushed back the Patriot skirmish line. General Howe then marched his 13,000 man army into a wheat field and deployed it for battle in an impressive display of martial gallantry. Howe seemed to be bluffing Washington into retreat, which he refused to do. Thus, Howe prepared his army for an attack rather than marching into the teeth of the American fortifications on Hatfield and Purdy Hills. The British commander spied the weak point in the rebel line, Chatterton Hill. where we stand now. Sending a detachment of infantry and some 20 cannon to bombard and then capture Chatterton Hill, Howe hoped to uncover the isolated American right flank. The British and Hessian soldiers were met, though, by a determined musketry of a Connecticut regiment sent to slow their advance while Washington shifted Continentals to the hill, commanded by General Alexander McDougall, Colonel John Haslett, and other capable officers. The bombardment by the British unnerved the militia, but the timely American reinforcements slowed the British and Hessians. However, a Hessian force commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, who would eventually be killed at Trenton, was able to dislodge the militia that protected the American right flank. The line began to unravel as more Imperial soldiers rushed in to exploit the breakthrough. Soon, Washington's army was conducting a fighting withdrawal. Once again, Howe was slow to pursue the rebels, and Washington and his men slid further north as he employed a Fabian strategy to keep his army intact. Rather than pursue the Americans deeper into New York, Howe turned back toward New York City, where he planned to take the advantage of another of Washington's mistakes. Now that would be leaving Fort Lee hardly defended. I think it was what do you call it? A deserter got into the British lines and said, "Oh yeah, we're running water down. We're running buckets of water down to the river to be able to nourish ourselves with water." And there's hardly anybody there. It's more or less of a feint, more or less. So now we're going to take a look at the map provided. So here's a Battle of White Plains map provided by American Battlefield Trust. And you can see where Purdy Hill is, and Putnam and Heath by the Presbyterian Church, and where Howe was. McDougall on Chatterton Hill. So we are roughly looking north is that way. So north is behind me. So as we look, we got Brooks, Graham, Smallwood, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, who actually at this battle will earn himself recognition for commanding 2 guns and start becoming more and more in favor of Washington. So Alexander Hamilton actually became quite famous here at the Battle of White Plains. And then we have Haslett, we got Ritzema, I believe, who eventually defected to the British, and Webb. So we got Purdy, we got Putnam and whatnot behind, while Rawl and Von Donop and Leslie all attacked over here. And then there's Fisher Hill on the other side. But looking here, Liberty or Death, erected by the City of White Plains commemorative 225th anniversary. So where 1 is at, which is right here, that is Americans occupied Chatterton Hill and British approach from the south for number 2, which is right here. American pickets retreat at 3. Hessians under Ross seize the hill, which is number 4, which is right here. Now, Raw can be spelled multiple ways. I've seen R-A-H-L and I've seen R-A-double-L. British bombard Chatterton Hill at number 5, which is right here. And we are right here. So to our right over that way and along this line, because that is steep. And the Bronx River is somewhat in front of us. Okay, and then midday, British and Hessians crossed the Bronx River at 6 because they forded it right here. Hessians outflanked the Americans. Yep, that happens. I read that. 8 British Dragoon cavalry attacks, which is right here by Raw. Washington retires to North Castle, which is 12, which is right over here. British attack center of the lines, which is 13. And 14, British bombard American left flank, which is right over here. which is the road to Connecticut. And 15, British bombard right flank, which is right here. We're right here. So we're about 180 feet elevated right here. Some of the hills are even elevated more than that. On Hatfield Hill, we got Purdy Hill, Miller House. Some of these places still stand today, but yeah. So the battle happened all along here. And the Americans were flanked from that direction. So, and this is what remains of White Hills due to construction and urban growth. Now, I know that the Revolutionary War was also in and of itself a civil war. Uh, the White Plains was no different. There were a lot of families divided between the royal crown and the American cause of independence, and it split families apart. The Purdys, I believe, were one of them, as well as another family. I believe it's the Smiths, but we're going to get to that in our next book here, called "The Battle of White Plains: Washington and Howe in Westchester" by Stephen Paul DeVillo. This is um, one of the most recommended books for this battle. So let's get to it. So it says here, "The Battle of White Plains, Washington and Howe in Westchester" by Stephen Paul DeVillo, on page 56. It wouldn't be long before the corn stalks were put to the test. Early on the morning of October 28th, Howe roused his army and set out on a short march to White Plains, following the Mamaroneck Road north from Scarsdale. At the Secker Fork, named for the farming family of that name, the Fenimore Road branched off to the west, connecting the Mamaroneck Road with the York Road, while the right-hand column under Henry Clinton would continue on the Mamaroneck Road, with the two eventually meeting at the White Plains. Along the Fenimore Road, De Heister's advance guard ran into Spencer's division, which was hunkered down behind the stone walls, ready to contest the Hessian advance. A French and Indian War veteran, Major General Joseph Spencer was considered one of the best officers in the American Army. This was perhaps more than could be said of the men he commanded that day, who were mostly untried Connecticut militiamen. Spencer's mission, though, was not to attempt a heroic stand, but to only give the enemy as much annoyance as possible on their approach, and provide a report on their movements. In modern-day military parlance, Spencer's mission was to serve as a speed bump. The fields along Fenimore Road were crisscrossed by high stone walls, ideal for an American defense. From behind their stone walls, the Connecticut men opened fire and gave the Hessians a rough handling at first, inflicting significant casualties and prompting them to fall back and regroup. Renewing the attack, the Hessians were joined by some mounted dragoons, the sight of whom was enough to spark panic in the militiamen, who bolted for the Bronx River, some throwing down their muskets in their pell-mell flight. The Connecticut men had good reason for their hurried departure. Though few in number, the Hessian dragoons were indeed a sight to be feared. Hailing from Hesse Castle, they were essentially mounted infantry, armed with long, heavy swords, along with muskets and pistols. They were trained to fight either on foot or on horseback, as the occasion required. When running down fleeing infantry, dragoon was a byword for ruthlessness, but the pursuit that day was hampered by those troublesome stone walls. Unable to vault the high walls, dragoons were forced to lose time and momentum by riding around them. Colonel Johann Rahl, commanding a Hessian brigade, nevertheless ordered his men across while the others stood and stared at the swirling waters of the Bronx River. Emerging from the ford, Rahl ordered his sopping soldiers to pursue Spencer up the hillside. Spencer's men, though, had kept their powder dry halfway up the hill. they turned and delivered a discouraging volley. Rahl, reconsidering the wisdom of pursuing an unsupported assault, pulled his men back to occupy a low rise of Chatterton Hill near the village of Hart's Corners, today Hartsdale. Leaving his men to wring out their uniforms, Rahl waited orders while keeping a chary eye on the Americans. With most of his army arriving at the White Plains, Howe, traveling behind his left-hand column, was now aware of the threat posed by Chatterton Hill. If Howe had been planning an immediate frontal assault on the rebel lines, the troops atop Chatterton Hill forced him to reconsider. Military wisdom, then as now, frowned on making a frontal assault while ignoring an enemy force that could threaten your flank and rear. Fighting in linear formations, men couldn't fire in two directions at once, and even a small attack coming at their side or rear could throw a battle formation into disarray. By now, wary of American aggressiveness, Howe had little choice. Before launching any attack on Washington's main line, he would first have to clear Chatterton Hill. Ordering the assault, Howe was taken aback by what he took to be the refusal of the Hessian commander, De Heister, to send his soldiers into high waters of the ford. By now, Howe was growing increasingly annoyed with the obstreperous Hessian, who had dragged his feet before the battle of Brooklyn and was now seemingly doing so again. By the conventional rules of seniority, the 60-year-old Heister was second in command of the combined British-Hessian army. But Howe had taken the precaution of drawing up a dormant commission that would place Henry Clinton in command should anything happen to him. And it was to Clinton that Howe now turned, and he rode off to find him. Now, atop Chatterton Hill, Alexander McDougall took command of the American units and sorted them into a defensive formation. Joseph Spencer's arriving troops were placed in the fields along the southwest slope to dry out in the sunshine. Smallwood's Maryland Regiment was placed on the right center, supported by the 6th Regiment of Dutchess County Militia. Colonel John Brooks's Massachusetts Militia was placed alongside the Delaware Blues just south of the hill's crest. Like Delaware's John Haslet, Brooks had been trained as a physician, swapping his scalpel for a sword at the outbreak of the Revolution. The 1st and the 3rd New York, along with the Connecticut Militia, held the center of the line, facing east toward the White Plains, with Webb's 19th Continental at the extreme left, overlooking the Dobbs Ferry Road. Though appearing to be a mixed bag of units, these dispositions would prove crucial to the outcome of the fight. By accident or design, the best veteran regiments on the hill were positioned to receive the brunt of the British assault. Now, artillery was involved in this battle, and I want to talk about it here on page 62. However frightful, solid shot was limited to its reach and impact. Scarier were exploding shells fired by howitzers. Howitzers were especially designed to fire bombs, quote unquote, hollow iron balls filled with gunpowder with a fuse ignited by the flash of firing. Howitzers were identified by their short barrels, usually made of brass and buffed to a high sheen by their proud gun crews. The comically short barrels were made that way for safety. The friction caused by exiting a full-length cannon barrel could make a bomb explode prematurely. So the howitzer traded range for safety, limiting its effective reach to 750 yards or so. When handling these primitive exploding shells, one Major Henry Chapnell would devise a more lethal version a few years later, was far from an exact science in 1776. Gunners had to tinker with the elevation and fuse length to get them to explode where they would cause the most harm. Air bursts over the heads of the enemy were the result to aim for. The metallurgy of the cast iron shells meant that they would fragment into large, jagged chunks, ensuring that there would be no slight wounds. So, preparing the assault for an hour with an hour-long bombardment of the American positions, the Hessian gunners found their range and inflicted serious damage, bringing the militia to the brink of panic. Colonel John Haslet of the Delaware Blues described it as a continued peal of reiterated thunder, something a later century would term a drumfire barrage. Atop Chatterton Hill, the Connecticut militiaman Elisha Bostwick later recalled the horror of the day. "Oh, what a sight that was to see within a distance of 6 rods, those men with their legs and arms and guns and packs all in a heap." And while the Hessian artillerymen zeroed in with the Teutonic professionalism. The British cannoneers, by contrast, were of less use. They were firing from the lower elevation of Fisher Hill, and many of their balls overshot Chatterton Hill, while some fell short, bouncing down the steep slope to the consternation of the attacking column struggling upward. The immense clouds of smoke thrown up by the ignition of gunpowder, the fog of war, further degraded targeting as time went on. While the Maryland, Delaware, and Dutchess County units slowed down the frontal assault from the southern end of Chatterton Hill, keeping the retreat's northern back door open was the job of Colonel Charles Webb, commanding the 19th Continental Regiment at the left end of the American line. Webb ordered his Connecticut men to stand fast, and a belated British attempt to scurry up the north end of Chatterton Hill and cut off the American exit down the Dobbs Ferry Road was repulsed under the direction of young Captain William Hull, fighting in the vicinity of what today is the Battle of White Plains Park, which is where we stand right now. Webb's men would be the last American unit to exit Chatterton Hill, marching in good order down the Dobbs Ferry Road behind the Delaware and Maryland men and across the Chatterton Bridge to the safety of the forward American lines. To ensure their safe withdrawal, Washington directed Israel Putnam to detach men from Purdy Hill to cover their retreat. It wasn't necessary though. The British were not coming after them. Generals Leslie and De Heister had been ordered to take Chatterton Hill, and they had done exactly that. The victorious Hessians and British stood in place atop the conquered cornfields, perhaps with a triumphant hip hip huzzah, and advanced no further. Howe issued no orders to pursue. It was now past 3 o'clock, with less than 2 hours of daylight remaining. Still licking their wounds from Chatterton Hill, Alexander Leslie's brigade, including Rawls' Hessians and the 42nd Highlanders, was detailed to once again mount an uphill assault, this time on Miller Hill. Avoiding Miller Hill's eastern slope, where they would be exposed to gunfire from neighboring Mount Misery, Leslie decided to hook around and attack up the western slope. Glover coolly watched Leslie's brigade as they deployed off the present-day Cemetery Road and picked their way through the marshes along the Bronx River. The westerly slope of Miller Hill was only slightly more climbable than the eastern side, and was between a hill and a broad expanse of the river known as Willow Lake, meaning the British had a tight space in which to deploy. As the British, Hessians, and Scots arranged themselves for the attack, Glover unmasked his cannons and opened fire. Glover's 3 and 12-pounders quickly wreaked havoc on the exposed assault troops. Colonel Laomi Baldwin, looking down from Miller Hill, noted that Glover's cannonade soon made them run and scamper in the greatest confusion I ever saw. One American cannonball took the head off a Hessian artilleryman, perhaps providing the premise for one of Westchester's most enduring Halloween legends. Rawls' Hessian Brigade received fire from Glover's 24-pounder, causing mounting casualties, with more than 150 men already dead and wounded in an attack that hadn't quite started. Leslie called a retreat. The narrow space in which the British units were stacked up made it awkward to carry out an orderly withdrawal. The way west was blocked by Willow Lake, so the British had to retreat the way they came, falling back under flanking fire several hundred yards southward while they could cross the river and seek refuge on the comforting rise of Travis Hill. There, Leslie arranged his guns and began a brisk bombardment of Miller Hill. More than 1,000 yards from Miller Hill, and at a 250-foot elevation, 100 feet lower than the British guns firing at Miller Hill from Travis Hill were a significant disadvantage. Firing from a superior elevation, Glover's guns soon silenced them, and though shots would be exchanged over the next 3 days, the Battle of Miller Hill, and with it the Battle of White Plains, was essentially over. Now, among the battle's detritus were the bodies of dead soldiers. In those days before grave registration teams, the burial of the fallen was largely left to chance. Young British Captain William Glanville Evelyn, mortally wounded at the Battle of Pell's Point, died in Manhattan on November 6th and was buried with full honors in Trinity Churchyard. Others would not receive the same attention. Hessian dead at Chatterton Hill were casually buried on the field or left where they lay. Some of their remains would be turned up when the Americans returned to occupy the hill in 1778, to the shocked surprise of Joseph Plum Martin, who was actually here at the battle. Local rumor had the additional remains were found amid the development of the Battle Hill neighborhood in the 1920s. Several American dead were buried at White Plains Presbyterian Church, possibly along with an unknown number of British. Hessian and American casualties from the Battle of Pell's Point, who died at St. Paul's Church in Eastchester, were likewise buried in the surrounding churchyard in communal graves, where they are today honored in an annual commemorative ceremony. Now it gets a little bit more tragic when it comes to the Civil War within the American Revolution. Located on the edge of town, Abigail Purdy's home had escaped both British cannonballs and the torch of Major Austin. Her husband, Jacob, had survived his militia duty, and together they resumed their modest lives as farmers. Getting through the winter would be a challenge, but ere long it would be time to again sow the wheat fields, and the apple blossoms would once more brighten the trees on Purdy Hill. Anne Fisher Miller returned to her home to find that General Charles Lee had been a truly horrid house guest. In her absence, he'd taken a fancy to some of her curtains and thought they'd make a nice lining for his cloak. And though she had come through the battle better than any people in the area, as far as she knew, her two sons were alive and marching with their regiment to Fishkill, and her home, apart from broken furniture, was still intact. And though it would again be grief-stricken when, just before Christmas, news arrived that her two sons, John and Elijah Jr., had died in camp at Fishkill on December 21st. At some point, they had been transferred from Drake's 3rd Regiment of Westchester Militia to the 5th Continental Regiment. The cause of death simply listed as fever, possibly typhus or typhoid. Anne was able to have their bodies brought back from Fishkill, and they were buried alongside their father in the White Plains Presbyterian churchyard. Now, Anne Fisher Miller, she would see General Washington again and Charles Lee, especially for his court martial from the Battle of Monmouth. A lot of the Purdys, because they were the ones that were estranged, they became estranged. A lot of them would go up and move to Canada, and the family never really got together again. Jacob's brother, who was Jacob Purdy, brother Gabriel, along with a number of other Purdys and loyalist members of other local families, they left America and sought refuge in Canada at the close of the war. Obtaining a land grant in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, this band of Westchester loyalists established a community in what they duly named Westchester Valley. And a Westchester station remains on the map to this day, along with a Purdy Lane and a Purdy Cemetery. The loyalist Purdys flourished in their new home. And then there's a Purdy Wharf in Halifax. The loyalist Michael Chatterton remained on his farm. Like other families in White Plains, Chatterton's family split up after the war, with some opting to remove to Canada. A namesake of his, Michael Chatterton, and his family listed among the passengers on the ship Grace en route to new lives in St. John's, Nova Scotia. The senior Michael Chatterton lived to about 1785. So, a lot of that stuff, everybody who were loyalists in America decided to move up to British Columbia or up in Canada just because there were times where loyalists, even revolutionaries, they fought one another. They killed one another. They were beyond the loyalist Americans. They would be in the Continentals. They'd fight one another. These would be brothers. They'd be other parts of families. So in a sense, the Revolutionary War was a civil war as well. And White Plains here was no different. White Plains citizens, whether they were loyalists or American, whoever won the war, which was the Continentals, hence why we have America now, the loyalists felt so strongly moved that they needed to get out. That way they don't face any repercussions of the sort, which is a tragedy. But at the same time, I can understand why. So they left home and went up to Canada for that. And that reminds me of just how serious the Revolutionary War was taken. You know, family against family. There's other instances that I would like to visit of family versus family in battle in the American Revolutionary War, and I hope to get there soon. But the White Plains was a great synopsis, or a great starting point to talk about the American Revolution, just not being the Revolutionary War, but one of our like first civil wars, if you ever want to say it like that. But that's just my thoughts on the American Revolution as itself. Now, what I want to leave off here with is the campaign of General William Howe. You see, after the British were kicked out of Boston, they went up to Canada. I believe it was Nova Scotia, I believe, and regrouped, got their stuff together, came back down and attacked New York. That's fine and all. And Washington believed New York City was going to be the point where he would attack. New York City was vital. It's still vital all throughout the Revolutionary War. The Hudson Valley and Champlain Valley is all vital for the Revolutionary War. And the one thing I see in this campaign reminds me of future campaigns. One taking place with Winfield Scott's campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City. Even though that itself was a win, but his younger successor, George B. McClellan, this actually reminds me of the Peninsula Campaign of the Civil War. Howe is hesitant to fight the Continentals, same as McClellan was hesitant to fight the Confederates, and he would be slow moving, and it would give eventually Washington the advantage to win the battle and ultimately win the war. Now, that didn't happen with the Confederates, but it happened still to this day. Like if you see it, how slow to react. He's slow to attack. He's slow to do everything to get this battle going. Yeah, he sends attack forces, but he doesn't necessarily win. He doesn't eliminate his goal, which is destroy the Continental Army. The same way McClellan was to destroy the Confederate Army, or at least capture Richmond. Both these goals were lost because of how slow and ineffective they were at being slow and taking their time. But I wanted to end that on this. I wanted to end here on this. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe for the next videos, and hit the notification button, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great one.